Welcome to episode 7 of Ship, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. We're bringing you stories every week of sea, space, history and creativity, all with Royal Museums Greenwich curators and special guests. If you'd like to get in touch with us, or you've got a topic you'd like us to discuss, or a question that you'd like to ask our experts, then please do that. If you search for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter, you will find us, and we'd love to hear from you. So today's topic is all about food and the issue of food supplies. How does the food get from the people who produce it to the people who eat it? Obviously ships in the sea play a key role in all of this, in keeping our shelves stocked, but often it's an invisible part of the system. We have our own reminder of the importance of maritime trade at Royal Museums Greenwich. The Cutty Sark is sitting right out the front on the waterfront. She was one of the most famous tea clippers, was built to join in with the tea trade. And there's a reminder there of Britain's trading past, but the ships haven't gone away. They might not have big sails, they might not look like the Cutty Sark, but they are still there. And a huge proportion of trade to and from the UK is transported by sea. So that is what we're going to be digging into today, especially the food aspect. So we have some fabulous guests to join us on this journey. So let me introduce them to you. We have Laura Boone, who is the Lloyd's Register Foundation Public Curator of Contemporary Maritime. We have Robert Blythe, who's the Senior Curator of World and Maritime History. And we have Mike Sellers, who is the Port Director at Portsmouth International Port. So tell us a little bit about your connections with this topic. Robert, perhaps we'll start with you.
Well, obviously there's the personal interest of keeping my tummy from rumbling, so I'm interested in food from that perspective, as you can probably see. But I'm also actually interested in the history of trade and how supply routes were formed over time. So there's a historical aspect to my interest. And
Laura, how about you?
So as a contemporary curator, I'm really interested in our continual reliance on the ocean for our day-to-day life, but also uncovering the stories of the people involved in the industry. So often these kind of working people histories aren't recorded, and I think it's really important that we do that.
And Mike, tell us a little bit about your role.
So I'm the director of Portsmouth International Port, which is the port authority and responsible for the commercial operations within Portsmouth. And my connection really is that ports handle 95% of the goods in trade, which is seaborne. So crucial to everything, including fruit and vegetables. And there's an awful lot of fruit and vegetables that come through Portsmouth.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to start to set the scene with a port that's not a modern day port, but the Port of London is one of the most important ports in this country, but also has been written about by a lot of people. And we're going to hear a description of the Port of London, the Thames, from the late 1800s. And this is an excerpt from Joseph Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness, read by Simon Kane.
And indeed, nothing is easier for a man who has, as the phrase goes, followed the sea with reverence and affection, than to evoke the great spirit of the past upon the lower reaches of the Thames. The tidal current runs to and fro in its unceasing service, crowded with memories of men and ships it had borne to the rest of home or to the battles of the sea. It had known and served all the men of whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake to Sir John Franklin, knights all, titled and untitled, the great knight-errants of the sea. It had borne all the ships whose names are like jewels flashing in the night of time, from the Golden Hind returning with her rotund flanks full of treasure to be visited by the Queen's Highness and thus pass out of the gigantic tale, to the Erebus and Terror, bound on other conquests, and that never returned. It had known the ships and the men. They had sailed from Deptford, from Greenwich, from Erith, the adventurers and the settlers, king's ships and ships of men on change, captains, admirals, the dark interlopers of the eastern trade, and the commissioned generals of the East India fleets. Hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, they all had gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? The dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires.
It's such a fabulous excerpt, and it was Laura's recommendation, so you deserve credit for that. And the thing that really strikes me about it is that the point that the port stays the same. History comes and goes, people come and go, and the port is the one fixed point that everything else washes over. What struck the rest of you? Laura, what did you pick out of that?
I think the sentence of mystery of the unknown, often when I'm reading accounts of people who spend their careers at sea, there's the thing of leaving your community, and the ports that you travel to from London, especially when we look at the kind of historical accounts where people perhaps were growing up in small villages, and then we're ending up in places like Shanghai, which they would have had kind of no points of references about. It's just that kind of amazing sense of adventure and heading off into the unknown.
Robert, how about you?
Well, I think first of all you can say is that Conrad could certainly write. And of course, English wasn't even his second language. So he's really sort of mastered that sort of sense of the Thames as being this sort of, artery of history. He's really picking up both on the contemporary, what he would have seen, because he was a sailor himself, what he would have seen entering the Port of London, but then reflecting on how that landscape, deals with the past as well. So it's a fascinating excerpt.
And Mike, was there something in there that struck you?
Yeah, for me, it's how important ports are and were to the economy and to trade, just the sheer volume of ships that would have been going through the Thames, and also the risk that was taken when the ships that didn't return, just in terms of the importance of building that economy, and also for London, and everything around London, that wealth really came from shipping.
Well, that was a great way to set the scene. So let's get going on our discussion today. And Robert, you've got the first object we're going to talk about, and it's a map. Tell us what this is.
Well, this is a piece of Second World War propaganda. It is a map that shows the position of every British ship above 3,000 tons on the 24th of November, 1937. And essentially, this is a wartime navy saying, look what we've got to protect. The protection of British shipping is our job, and British shipping is absolutely everywhere.
One of the things I love about this map is that I somewhere in my head, I thought that this kind of map was a modern concept, because now we have, satellite imagery, and we've got all these real-time maps of where ships are. And there's something I love about the fact that the idea isn't new. It's just that, but this must have taken so much effort to assemble. How many ships are on that map?
Oh, there are hundreds of ships on the map. And of course, as I say, it's only ships above 3,000 tons. So there would be a whole slew of smaller vessels, ones involved in coastal trading, not just British coastal trading, but coastal trading between different ports of the world. And then set within each of the principal territories that Britain is trading with are these little tables that outline what percentage of the particular raw materials come from that territory back to Britain. So it's a real sort of political statement, is that Britain cannot survive without its external trade.
And what sort of things were the ships carrying? Is this goods for build things out of, or is a lot of it food? What's coming and going?
So essentially, it's everything that's required to additionally feed the nation. So there will be things like frozen and refrigerated goods coming in. So frozen meat, say from perhaps New Zealand or South America.
So even back in 1937, there was
absolutely. You can go back into the 19th century for refrigerated and frozen goods. So you might have dairy products coming in from as far away as New Zealand, butter from New Zealand coming in, and then still on the foodstuffs, perhaps grain for bread coming in from the United States and Canada. And then on top of that, there's all the raw materials that industry needs, everything from iron ore, all of Britain's oil at this time would have to come in by sea. So the shopping list goes on, and that's good enough in peacetime, but of course it becomes crucial when you enter a war situation.
And
Helen, can I just chip in there? If you look at whilst the European countries, the non-EU countries have all been under lockdown, you mentioned about satellite imagery, you can still see imagery of the amount of shipping that is still going on, and how important that is to continuing to to keep the economies moving even during that lockdown period.
So the visualization is still an important way to remember that this, because otherwise it's invisible, isn't it? I guess that's the point of making any of these maps, both the modern day ones and the original, is that how would you know if you weren't checking? And Robert, how important was this to the concept of, because obviously the coloured bits on that map were the British Empire, the bits of the British Empire. How is this kind of trade linked in with empire? How important is all of this to Britain's power?
Well, obviously, the British Empire is a sort of vast territorial complex that Britain can trade with freely. So without necessarily the need for duties and tariffs. And of course, Britain invests to exploit the resources of empire. So, for example, there will be rubber plantations in Malaya, absolutely essential. Huge prairie farms in Canada, sheep stations in Australia. All of these things are designed essentially to push material back to Britain, to keep home industries going and to keep stomachs at home full.
And how long is it then that Britain has been, I mean, when was the last time that Britain could feed itself, or did feed itself?
It's a difficult point to pin down, but the last time that Britain absolutely had to feed itself was probably during the Napoleonic Wars, so the first part of the 19th century. After that, you've got essentially a long period of peace until the First World War. So the British supply chain wasn't threatened in that period. So trade flowed fairly freely and you could have fluctuating levels of home production. And then suddenly, once you've got a crisis like the First and Second World Wars, where your supply chains are under active assault and attack, then you really do begin to see problems. You have to adapt at home with rationing, and you then need to boost home production. So in the Second World War, you have Dig for Victory, parks ploughed up, planted with potatoes and other vegetables to try and plug the gap that's been opened up by the disruption of normal trade.
So we think of globalization as being quite a new thing, but actually in this country, it goes back a long, long way.
Yeah, it's going back hundreds of years. And of course, some products that are, typically British have to come in from abroad. We are not one of the great tea growing countries of the world, yet most people will have tea every single day. So tea has got to be imported. And there are a whole slew of products that have become quintessentially British tastes, but must be sourced from overseas.
And of course, all of this trade can only happen because people actually make it happen. It takes an enormous number of workers to move ships, to move cargo. So let's move on to Laura and your first exhibit for us. Tell us about the letter that you've got here.
Yeah, of course. So as you've said, the merchant navy is at the heart of all this trade coming in, and all of those dots that were on Robert's map, all were boats with people on them. And one of the interesting things is that during the Second World War, it's felt that there wasn't really the recognition for the merchant navy. I mean, it wasn't actually till 2000 that they were even allowed to march on Remembrance Day at the cenotaph. So there's always been this feeling that the merchant navy hasn't necessarily really been recognised. And during the Second World War, it was one of the most dangerous roles to have when there was like the heavy U-boat bombing of their ships. So at the museum, we've got a great oral history project that was started in the 1960s that aimed to kind of record these experiences of life at sea. So we have over 500 reel-to-reel tapes that record the experiences of people. But quite interestingly, within the kind of over 150 people that were recorded, we only have 2 women. And these were wives of sailors talking about basically their experience of being left behind. We've restarted recording oral histories to try and capture this experience of life at sea and being part of the Merchant Navy. An important change in this is actually recording female experience as well. So the letter that I have is of the first female navigating cadet to join the Merchant Navy, a lady called Nina Baker. And this is 1970. And there's this, in some ways, unsurprising letter, but also quite shocking, still the same, in which she gets a rejection letter from a company that quite outright says, we regret to advise you that at present no positions exist in our fleet that are occupied by young ladies, and we are therefore unable to offer you employment.
It's fantastically patronising, isn't it? The modern eye. I mean, it's
there's no reasoning behind it. It's just like, well, we don't have any women at the moment, so
we're not going to have any ever. That's the end of it.
Like it just isn't going to happen. Luckily, however, she did have kind of supporters in the recruitment board who did find her more kind of supporting companies, and Nina did enter as a cadet. And there's this lovely copy of a letter that her father wrote. She was only kind of a teenager at the time when she was applying, so it was actually her dad doing a lot of her correspondence for her. And it's green because it's the copy. And it just says, I'm sure the company will not regret its decision to recruit women into the service. And Nina was a kind of a pioneer in being one of the first women to join the Merchant Navy. And at the time, it was actually national news. So we have newspaper clippings. There's a rather patronising headline where it says, Nina Baker will have no shortage of escorts at college. But actually, generally, she was really, really supported. And this is an area that we continue to collect in. We know that for some women now, women are still underrepresented within the maritime industry. And some do still face kind of challenges. There can be, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, there was some kind of assumptions raised about why a woman might be wanting to enter this very, very masculine world, and they could face restrictions. Luckily, there are more and more opportunities for women within maritime, and you will begin to see women at all levels of the industry, but it is still something that is underrepresented.
It's interesting working as a scientist at sea that it's still it has never happened to me, but there are definitely women colleagues I have who will talk about there not being separate bathrooms for women on a ship, for example. So some quite that built into the ship is the assumption that it's only going to have men on board, and so they're faced with these issues of and it's not an excuse, but it's just that it hadn't occurred to them.
Yeah,
hadn't occurred to anyone.
That's quite common, and quite a lot of the cadets, it's normal it was normal then when you're a cadet to share a room, but they'd obviously be the only woman on board. So actually, in some ways, you got slightly better treatment because you'd have to be given your own room, which wasn't getting just because they couldn't have you sharing a room. You could sometimes end up with your own bathroom, but in other cases, the conditions for you aren't ideal. Being away at sea obviously isn't particularly family friendly, so you will still have some women who, if they choose to have a family, will then look at jobs such as being kind of harbour masters or working so that they can have a little bit more of a kind of home life balance. But actually you see this with men as well. It's quite common right in the kind of early 19th century. We have men talking about their experience, and at a certain point in their career they decide that actually they want to spend more time in their kind of home countries. They want to be able to spend more time with their families.
Brilliant. Well, perhaps before we move on to Mike's object, perhaps Mike, you could say something about your experience of this today. Like, what's the situation with recruiting women into the Merchant Navy today?
Not so much the Merchant Navy, but my experience within Maritime UK is that there is still quite a significant difference in balance between it's very much male dominated, and Maritime UK are certainly trying to encourage more females within the maritime industry, and there is a Women in Maritime charter that most of the ports have actually signed up to try and encourage more diversity within the ports industry. there is still that balance. It's still not seen as an industry that is particularly, for want of a better word, sexy in terms of getting more people to it. But I think it's because a lot of what we do is not necessarily public facing, and there is so many different types of roles within the ports industry, everything from project management, engineering, stevedoring, loading, discharging ships, finance, marketing. That there's lots of opportunity to start to increase that diversity, but it's still a challenge. It's still a challenge getting people interested, and certainly getting females interested in the ports industry.
So a work in progress. Well, let's move on to your exhibit, your first exhibit. Show us what you've got, because you are the first person to actually have a physical exhibit with you. Tell us what this is.
Are you ready for this? It's a banana.
You've got a banana.
So the reason for that as an exhibit is 50%, so half of the bananas that are consumed in this country passes through Portsmouth Port. They don't come that colour. They come in green, and they need to be ripened first before they end up at supermarkets. We've got cold storage. There are ripening centres close to the port that they go to. That's 30 million bananas a week that comes through this port. So that's half of, so 60 million bananas a week that are consumed in the UK.
So that's and it's not just bananas, is it? I mean, Portsmouth does sort of specialise a bit in fresh fruit, fresh produce.
Yeah, so obviously for the bananas, and Robert was explaining the reason for the fact that in this country we don't grow everything, and that there are certain products that are still in high demand, and it's roughly about 50% of food products that's imported, and the rest is grown in the UK. But being the second largest cross-channel port, and we've got the most destinations across to France, and to Spain as well, but we also see products such as root vegetables coming in from France, tomatoes coming in from Spain, and it's not just imports. We export our fish, so we get an awful lot of fish coming down from the west coast of Scotland, and they end up in the restaurants in Paris. So it works both ways in terms of the products that are coming through.
So there's plenty of coming and going. And docks, you come from a family of dock workers. So just tell us a little bit about because there's a very strong identity associated with docks and ports, and people really feel connected to it. What was it like growing up in that kind of family? Did you visited docks? How did that seep into the rest of your life?
Yeah, I did. I came from a family of dock workers, and I came through the traditional route that dockers and dock workers' sons ended up working in the ports industry. Didn't start off life working in the ports industry, but as soon as I started to do it, it's really hard to describe. It's just a fantastic world, and no 2 days are the same. And it was really interesting to listen to Robert and Laura in terms of their items. Certainly containerization has changed things. There aren't as many ships, there are bigger ships. It's all about economies of scale. But for the fresh produce, containers are not necessarily ideal because they're handled more in terms of loading and unstuffing the containers. So we still get what we call reefer ships that are refrigerated, basically big refrigerated vessels that have that palletized fruit in there as well. But yeah, it's changed an awful lot. Things like 9/11 and security. When I was very young, I used to be able to go onto the docks with my dad. I went on board the ship, saw the captains. And was able to actually look around and see what was happening. Now, certainly, a lot of cities don't always appreciate the activities and the impact that the ports are having on their cities.
And it's a real shame, isn't it? Because we're talking about this. It's not like global trade has stopped, but it has become invisible. And you know, the port used to be, if you read any description, if you go to almost any author who was writing about a coastal town, they talk about the waterfront as being the critical place, right? That's where you go to find out what's going on, to get news. And it's all of that has sort of been lost. And do you feel that loss? How does, you know, do you have to keep reminding the people of Portsmouth that you exist?
Yeah, and actually there's an interesting quirkiness with Portsmouth, because we're owned by the local authority. So generally, when you look at ports within the UK, probably a good 80% are privately owned, with their own shareholders, and their profits will go to their shareholders. Whereas with Portsmouth, we're owned by the city. So you know, it's not only the kind of added economic value of the activity here, it's also the profits directly go into those essential council services. But in answer to your question, I don't see that difference, because I'm here every day, and you know, I've worked at a number of ports, and I see what's happening within the ports. But yeah, generally, that because of security, members of the public can't see that activity. They don't always see the waterfront. We are very fortunate on the Solent that a lot of the, you know, Portsmouth itself is a island city, and you know, that most people can see all the different activities on the Solent and can see those ships coming and going, which is always quite interesting.
The reminders are still there. Well, if you're just joining us, this is the Ships, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. This week we are talking about food supplies and food cargo in history and in the present. And we've got curators Laura Boone and Robert Blythe, and Mike Sellers, who's the port director at Portsmouth International Port. So just to move us on a little bit, we've got a poem next we're going to hear that Robert suggested, and each verse, the lovely thing about this poem is that each verse tells the story of a different type of ship. So this is Cargoes by John Masefield, read by Simon Kane.
Quinquireme of Nineveh from distant Ophir, rowing home to haven in sunny Palestine, with a cargo of ivory and apes and peacocks, sandalwood, cedarwood, and sweet white wine. Stately Spanish galleon, coming from the isthmus, dipping through the tropics by the palm green shores with a cargo of diamonds, emeralds, amethysts, topazes, and cinnamon, and gold-moyed oars. Dirty British coaster with a salt-caked smokestack, butting through the channel in the mad March days with a cargo of tyne coal, road rails, pig lead, firewood, ironware, and cheap tin trays.
It's such a lovely description of the variety at sea. Robert, do you just want to tell us briefly why you suggested that?
Well, I suppose it goes right back into the ancient past, showing just how long trade, of course, has been important to us. I just love the final verse with this put, 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 put beat that it's got, which is literally the engine of this, you know, clapped out British ship, you know, plying its trade, which of course is so unglamorous compared to those fantastic cargoes of the ancient past.
It is very much the grass is greener sort of poem, isn't it? All these beautiful jewels and things. Everyone else gets jewels and we get tin trays.
Exactly.
So let's move on to your second exhibit, which is another map, but this time it is the Port of London. So tell us a little bit about this.
Well, we were talking earlier about the invisibility of modern cargo shipping, because of course it tends now to be in very large purpose-built coastal ports. But in this map, you can just see how the Port of London, you know, literally pierces the heart of the capital. It's right into the center of London itself, and it shows the sort of enormous sprawling complex of ports and warehouses that are required to keep not just London, but the broader British economy going. And what this map also shows, of course, is how integrated the port network is with land transport as well. So once things arrive in London by sea, they are then quickly distributed around the countryside by road and rail.
And how did this fit? So this is the is it 1950, this one?
1950s,
Around that time.
yes.
So this is a time when, there's been the Second World War, there's been a lot of, it's been a struggle. There's still rationing in 1950. It's been very sort of grey in some ways. There's been no treats. How does all of this change? You go into the 50s and suddenly there's this, there's these science, modern world, there's all these adverts for housewives with modern technology. How is the type of trade changing during this time?
So to begin with, Britain is of course trying to export as much as it possibly can to build up its reserves and pay off some of its debts. But as trade recovers, products begin to come back in for the first time. Bananas will reappear after the Second World War. And of course, if you've never seen or certainly never eaten a banana before, it's an extremely odd fruit. So that will be, something quite new.
They're also really persistent. So this is a weird thing, but so I was one of the times I was at sea for 6 weeks. So you run out of fresh fruit after 6 weeks, and so you're living off tinned everything by the end. And I remember coming into port in Massachusetts, and we weren't allowed off the ship until the customs officer had been on. The customs officer brought a banana, and you could smell it everywhere in the ship. It was so distinctive, and everyone was like, "Who's?" And it's not, this is not a banana focused episode for anyone who's wondering, but what was interesting is that it was so distinctive. I think if you have bananas around, you take them for granted almost, and even 6 weeks away from them, and yeah, everyone was like little rats going, sorry, I interrupted you, but carry on.
Of course, much as we love our bananas, they cannot be considered, a staple product. So, the post-war boost will be to get things literally like grain for daily bread in. And here in London, the substantial complex towards the right of the map, which is the Royal Victoria and Albert docks, they have enormous grain milling facilities. So they're actually able to scoop wheat off the ship. It goes straight into the granary, it's milled into flour, and then that flour will be bagged up at the dockside and then shipped off to bakeries, shops, whatever. So you're getting a sort of integrated system.
And how did, because of course one of the things that shipping allows, especially shipping from long distances, it allows things to turn up that probably shouldn't be there in that season, and there's this big shift in what food is available when. Tell us a little bit about that.
So essentially, even in the 1980s, Britain could produce about 80% of its own foodstuffs. But what you get from the 1950s onwards as rationing eases is a greater sophistication of the British palate. They want more and more exotic and new products, and some fresh fruit and vegetables simply cannot be transported by sea, because no amount of refrigeration is actually going to keep them fresh enough for that long sea voyage. And it's interesting, now the Royal Victoria and Albert Docks is the site of London's City Airport, and actually it's air freight, which doesn't carry vast amounts of goods in comparison to sea, but will allow you, for example, to have strawberries on Christmas Day, which of course defeats any form of homegrown seasonality. Strawberries are for summer and for Wimbledon fortnight, but no, you can have them on Christmas Day because they'll come in from probably North Africa, but they have to come by freight because they will spoil if they come in by sea. So you've now got the range of products that's coming in is a reflection of changing technologies, but also changing palate as well, what we want to eat and when.
So let's move on to another one of those technologies which people don't think of as a technology. We've touched on it already, but obviously the thing we think of when we think of modern ships now is container ships, which are huge, great beasts, astonishingly large. And we're brought up with efficiency now, so we take them for granted. But it wasn't always an obvious idea. Laura, tell us a little bit about your next exhibit.
Yeah, of course. So from Rob's map, I live in East London, and some of the place names are familiar, but the area's changed beyond recognition. We no longer have the ports right in the centre of London. And the reason because of this is containers. So doesn't sound like the most exciting or radical of technologies. It's basically just a giant metal box. But it is something that we can say has completely changed the world. It's completely changed the way that we trade and the way that we live. Looking around my room now, pretty much everything that I can see has probably got to me via a container ship. And the reason why this is it makes it just very, very cheap. So in the mid 1950s, a haulage owner called Malcolm McLean had the brainwave that actually it would be much easier if you could have metal containers that you could take off the ship and put directly onto transport. And one of our exhibits is a ship model that we have here at the museum called the Ventura. And this is one of the very early container ships. Now it looks very different to the container ships we have today. It's actually a converted oil ship. And the containers themselves have a slightly odd shape to them. They almost look like giant loaves of bread in that model. And that's because they're actually old railway carriages. So they've taken the wheels and the axis off the bottom and just put them straight on the ship. Now, this one's only carrying 16 containers, whereas very quickly this idea took off. Initially, it was considered to be quite a kind of niche way. It wasn't expected to have that much of a radical change. But very quickly, by the 1980s, over 80% of all the goods in the world were being carried this way. And very, very quickly, by kind of the early 1990s, you're getting ships like the Ever Royal, which can carry over 4,000 containers, which is here now. You can see it's changed drastically from a ship. It's just designed to carry as many of these containers as possible. These are quite slow ships. They're quite fuel intensive, but with the economies of scale, you just want to be able to carry as many containers as possible. And today we've got the situation that the biggest container ships can now actually carry 23,000 containers.
Which is an astonishing number.
An astonishing number.
I always feel that there should be a rule that containers should all have written on the outside what they've got on the inside.
Yeah,
it would be fascinating.
It'd be really fascinating to work out what's going on. And what's really interesting is certain goods. So, for example, when you're manufacturing a kind of padded jacket, it might go on a ship several times. So it might be going through several countries, generally in Southeast Asia, to be made along that. It's not just having the journey from one factory to the consumer. But it's incredibly cheap. So it's estimated that to ship an iPad, which will cost the consumer several £100s, maybe only costs about 8 cents US. So cheap that in the grand scale of things, transportation has actually become almost negligible for the companies. And this has made kind of routes of trade that didn't exist before really, really profitable. So lots of the ways that we consume now, so for example with fast fashion, being able to buy a t-shirt for a couple of pounds is only possible because the shipping is so cheap. It's become so efficient. But
this has also had an impact on the port as being at the heart of a city, isn't it? Because most, in order to have the sort of port that can take one of these ships, you need a big port.
Yeah. So this is one of the major changes, is that lots of the inner city ports are not deep enough for the big container ships. So this means that there's a push. So in London, now we have Tilbury as our closest port. They can take much bigger ships. But also it's also cheap land. So you no longer need to have as many big warehouses right in the center of the city, because you're able to get your containers straight off the ships, either onto a lorry or onto a train and away. Also, the warehouses themselves are a form of security. The enclosed ports were a form of security. Theft was a massive problem from these ships, but actually by having enclosed containers, you're solving a lot of this problem.
Well, let's move on to the way things look today. So, Mike's obviously containers are the way we think of cargo, and that's what we see mostly in the modern port. But then when our trade routes, when problems come along, all of this massive system of trade is invisible until something like COVID-19 comes along, and suddenly the critical nature of this system is exposed. Mike, perhaps tell us a little bit about your next exhibit before you show it to us.
Yeah, so obviously, because we handle an awful lot of fresh produce, and we kind of fit in the in-between bracket, I suppose, from what Laura was talking about in terms of deep sea containers. There are only a limited number of ports around the UK that can handle the large deep sea containers, and get probably about 60% of freight is also just-in-time freight, short sea shipping. And that's where Portsmouth really specialises within the short sea shipping. So very early on with the COVID crisis, there was, there was this kind of panic buying and, stripping of supermarket shelves. And that trade was still flowing, that just-in-time trade was still flowing. So we were very keen to get the message out to consumers, to the UK, that the ports are still active, they're still busy, and this trade is still flowing. And you mentioned critical. There are particular critical freight routes, and only in this last week, the Department for Transport have secured those critical freight routes, which includes a number to Portsmouth.
So let's have a look at the video. So I guess the question here is, what's been the response? Have you noticed that people are suddenly paying a lot more attention to you? You knew you were important all along, but has everyone just sort of discovered you through all of this?
I think, and I'm sure you'll agree this, but certainly within the maritime industry and ports, we've almost been taken for granted that it just happens. And for us, quite a significant amount of our trade, 60% of our trade, is with Europe. And the bit that really started to highlight the challenges around the ports of maritime UK was the potential no-deal Brexits and leaving the EU. And that certainly did start to raise that profile of the importance of the trade through the ports, particularly, as you've seen on that video, the roll-on, roll-off traffic, where these goods are fast moving, they're just in time, they need to get to their next destination quickly, and sometimes those trailers are coming back on the ferries in the evening. And COVID is exactly the same. That the whole situation around lockdown and goods still needing to flow, and key workers. I mean, the ports industry, maritime industry, have been seen and viewed as key workers through the whole COVID challenge, and rightly so, because there are people coming to work whilst others are at home, taking that risk of infection to ensure that those goods are still flowing.
It's obviously a really important role. And just give us a sense of the complexity of the system. You talked about the just-in-time delivery system, and that it sounds like a machine where everything's got to mesh perfectly. How complicated is that coordination problem?
It's pretty smooth, to be honest with you. I mean, the ferries will arrive and have discharged and loaded within an hour and a half. So it's a very quick turnaround. That's the whole point of it being roll on, roll off. And they are a lot of them come as driver accompanied. So the driver will travel with the goods, take it to that destination, and go back. So yeah, in general, it's fairly streamlined. There are challenges, particularly when it comes to any border checks and anything that's going to happen in the future with that freight, and they're the sort of things that we're very much focused on for the future. Yeah, it's a slick, streamlined operation.
Well, it sounds like you're very much in control of the UK's food supplies, which is very good news. And we're almost at the end of the time we've got. I have one question from Twitter, which I don't know which of you, one of you might know the answer to this. It's from someone whose Twitter handle is shipbuilderD. And the question is that I expect in the times of sale, in the days of sale, arrival times for incoming shipments must have been very approximate. So how many days supply of food did the UK have to keep in stock? Because I guess now with the just-in-time system, it arrives just as it's needed. But in the past, perhaps this is a question for Robert or Laura, how much of a supply do you need? You know, what kind of warehouses do you need to kind of cover the uncertainty in arrival times?
Well, the government would have had certain central stocks of things like wheat, barley, those sorts of things. I mean, it might be weather related that causes the problem. So for example, if there was a big freeze, as there might be in the past, ships couldn't get into London because the Thames had frozen. So that would cause just the most terrific transport problems, because everything from food to coal and everything else simply couldn't get in. And it's difficult to deal with that sort of problem in the past when road transport is pretty poor. It ceases really to be a problem when you've got an integrated rail network, because even if there's a logjam at one port, you assume that other ports may be open, and it will only be in, you know, a critical crisis like a war that universal national action will be taken. So a tricky question to answer because
it's a difficult one to put you on the spot for.
Helen, I might be able to answer a little bit, certainly in terms of the way that we see the goods that are flowing out to the Channel Islands. So that 90% of everything that's consumed on the Channel Islands will come through Portsmouth, and it is very much just in time. So there isn't a bakery on the Channel Islands. So for any entrepreneurs out there, that you might want to look at a bakery, but for what we have seen is that if there are weather problems in the Channel Islands, we're very sheltered as a port, but if there are weather problems on the Channel Islands and that delays up to 48 hours, the supermarket shelves are empty.
It's an astonishing system. It is, the whole distribution network of food is one of those things that not only do we not appreciate it, but the more you find out about it, the more impressive the whole thing is. Right, well, we are out of time, so we will be back next week with lots more sea, space, history and creativity. As a reminder, if you want to contact us on social media, you can find us by searching for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. If you've enjoyed the show today, the museum would very much appreciate it if you fancied leaving a donation. Obviously we're closed and so there's no ticket sales and that kind of thing coming in. So if you fancy helping the museum out, a little something in the tip jar would be very much appreciated. You can do that on the museum website. And also don't forget, there's all kinds of other free activities that the museum is doing while the physical buildings are closed. There are online classes and videos and blogs and kids activities and all kinds of stuff, all at rmg.co.uk. Next week, we will be talking about Forgotten Greenwich, the hidden histories of this fabulous part of London, right where the museum sits. And there are things that have washed up on the shores of the Thames and stories of pioneers at the Royal Observatory. So we'll be talking everything Greenwich next week. And in the meantime, it just remains for me to thank our fabulous contributors, Laura Brune, Robert Blythe and Mike Sellers. Thank you to Simon Kane for the readings, to Steve Thompson for the music, James Gill was the producer, and I'm Helen Chowsky. I'll see you next week.